The last Roman governor of Britannia, Magnus Maximus, had drained the province of its best warriors in his failed bid for imperial power. Now, in the year 410 AD, the legions were gone. Emperor Honorius had sent a final, cold message to the Britons: they must fend for themselves. The once great province of Britannia, a jewel of Rome's western dominion, was unraveling. Towns like Londinium, Eboracum, and Camulodunum, once bustling centres of commerce and military power, now stood vulnerable. The Roman roads that had once bound the province together were now patrolled by desperate warbands, some Briton, some Pict, some Saxon. Among the ruins of Roman order, a man named Ambrosius Aurelianus walked through the scorched remains of a villa near Caliva Atrebatum. He had been born into a noble Romano-British family, one of the last to still hold onto the old ways. His father had been a Roman official, but now the title of official meant nothing. The Saxons, Angles, and Juters were coming in greater numbers. The Picts raided from the north and the Irish from the west. Britannia was breaking, and unless someone stood up to unite its warring tribes, it would fall into darkness. A kingdom without a king. The remaining Romanized Britons had turned to local warlords and self-declared kings, but none commanded all of Britannia. In the south, a man called Vortigern had emerged as the most powerful. He claimed the title of Dux Britanniarum, the leader of the British armies, but his power was built on uneasy alliances with Saxon mercenaries. Ambrosius knew Vortigern well. They had met years ago when the legions still marched in Britannia. Even then, Ambrosius had distrusted him, a man too willing to make deals with the very people who were tearing Britannia apart. With a band of loyal warriors, Ambrosius rode south to meet Vortigern. The journey took them through ruined Roman towns, now turned into fortresses against raiders. Some were held by Britons, others by Saxons who had come as mercenaries, but had stayed as conquerors. Everywhere was war. When they reached Vortigern's stronghold, Adinus Emrys, they found it swarming with Saxons. Their leader, Hengist, was at Vortigern's side, his warriors feasting in the halls like lords of the land. The Britons who stood in the shadows looked uneasy, their hands never far from their swords. Ambrosius approached the high table, where Vortigern sat with a golden goblet in hand. The older man's once dark hair was streaked with grey, his face hardened by years of struggle. "Ambrosius," Vortigern said, raising his goblet, "you have finally come to join me." Ambrosius glanced at Hengist. "It seems you already have allies." Vortigern smirked. "The Saxons are useful, my friend. They fight well, and they are loyal when treated fairly." Ambrosius narrowed his eyes. "Loyal until they want more land. Then they will take it, and you will be powerless to stop them." Hengist chuckled, drinking deeply from his cup. "We take what we earn in blood, Britain. You should understand that." Ambrosius turned back to Vortigern. "You are gambling with our people's future. Britannia needs a true leader, not a man who sells his land piece by piece." Vortigern's expression darkened. "And you think that leader is you? I think Britannia must stand on its own, or it will fall forever." Vortigern leaned forward. "Then perhaps you should leave before you say something you'll regret." Ambrosius met his gaze, unflinching. "You are making a mistake, Vortigern, and when the Saxons turn on you, don't expect the rest of Britannia to save you." He turned and walked away, his men following. As they left the hall, he heard the Saxons laughing behind them, but the laughter could not hide the truth. War was coming, and soon Britannia would burn. The gathering storm, Ambrosius rode north, gathering warriors along the way. Many Britons still remembered his family, still honoured the old ways. News spread quickly that a man of Roman blood was raising an army to push back the Saxons and restore Britannia's strength. At Venta Belgarum, he met with another powerful warlord, a man named Cuneda, whose people had long fought the Irish raiders. Cuneda was wary, but intrigued by Ambrosius's vision of a united Britannia. He agreed to fight if the Saxons turned against Vortigern. By the time Ambrosius reached Eboracum, he had over 1,000 warriors behind him. The city had once been a Roman stronghold, but now it was held by a Saxon warband under a chieftain named Octa. The Britons in the city had been forced to pay tribute, and many had been taken as slaves. Ambrosius did not wait. He led his warriors in a surprise attack, storming the gates in the dead of night. The battle was brutal, but the Saxons were caught off guard. By dawn, Eboracum was free, and the Britons raised the old banners of Rome once more. Word of Ambrosius' victory spread like wildfire. Britons who had lost hope now looked to him as their leader. Even some of Vortigern's allies began to question their loyalty. But Vortigern was not a man to be outplayed so easily. From his fortress in the west, he sent a message to Hengist and his Saxons. Saxons. The time for alliances was over. Now it would be war. And so, as the sun rose over a divided Britannia, the land stood on the edge of a great and terrible conflict, one that would decide the fate of the island for generations to come. The year was 441 AD. Britannia stood on the brink of destruction. Vortigern had cast his lot with the Saxons, trusting their loyalty, but Ambrosius Aurelianus had foreseen the betrayal. The storm was coming, and now it had arrived. The Night of Long Knives. The feast at Cataractonium was supposed to be a celebration, a gathering of Briton and Saxon leaders to secure peace. Vortigern had summoned his remaining allies, along with the Saxon warlords Hengist and Horsa. He still believed he could control them. Ambrosius had been invited, but refused to attend. He knew what the Saxons were capable of. His spies brought whispers of a sinister plan. Hengist intended to slaughter the Briton leaders in one stroke. The feast began with laughter and wine, but beneath the surface tension crackled. The Briton chieftains were unarmed, believing themselves among allies. Hengist sat beside Vortigern, drinking deeply, while his warriors filled the hall. Then came the signal. With a shout, the Saxons drew their concealed knives and fell upon the Briton leaders. The air filled with screams as throats were slit and blood pooled across the stone floor. Vortigern himself was seized, dragged from his seat as the last of his loyal guards were butchered. By dawn, the most powerful Briton chieftains were dead, their forces leaderless. The Saxons had played their hand, and they had won. The fall of Vortigern. News of the massacre spread like wildfire. Ambrosius, camped with his forces near Verulamium, received the report from his scouts. The Saxons had taken full control of the east, and Vortigern was now their puppet. Ambrosius wasted no time. He gathered his war council, men like Cuneda of the west and Caradoc of the northern hills. The time for waiting is over, he declared. Vortigern is finished. The Saxons will not stop until all of Britannia is theirs. His army moved swiftly, marching toward Vortigern's last stronghold, Dinas Emrys in the Welsh mountains. Vortigern, now a broken man, had fled there with what few loyal warriors remained. He had once been the most powerful man in Britannia, but now he was a fugitive in his own land. Ambrosius arrived at the fortress walls and sent an envoy to parley. Vortigern, desperate, agreed to meet. In the dim torchlight of the fortress hall, the two men stood face to face. "You were right," Vortigern admitted, his voice hollow. "The Saxons were never allies. They have taken my land, my power, everything." Ambrosius' expression was stone. "And yet you would not listen." Vortigern's hands trembled. "Help me take back what is mine. Together we can still... You still believe this is about your throne?" Ambrosius interrupted. "Britannia will not survive with you as its leader. Step down, Vortigern. Surrender, and I will allow you to live." Vortigern looked around the hall, at the few warriors who still followed him, at the looming figure of Ambrosius, at the torches flickering in the cold mountain air. He saw the end. Slowly he knelt. With that single act, Vortigern's rule was over. The war begins, but there was no time for celebration. Even as Vortigern surrendered, the Saxons were marching. Hengist and Horsa had gathered thousands, Saxons, Angles and Jutes, sweeping across the east like a storm. They burned Londinium, crushed the Briton defences at Duravernum, and now moved westward, hungry for the rest of the island. Ambrosius knew there was only one way forward. He rode north and summoned every Briton still willing to fight. Messengers were sent to the farthest reaches of the land, calling warriors to arms. The final battle for Britannia was coming. The year was 443 AD. The Saxons had carved their kingdoms into the east, from the shores of the Wash to the mouth of the Thames. Ambrosius Aurelianus, now the last hope of the Britons, had spent 2 years rallying warriors to his cause. The scattered tribes, the remnants of the Romanized elite, the mountain clans of the west, all now looked to him for leadership. The armies met at a place the Britons called Mons Badonicus, Badon Hill. It was here that Ambrosius would make his stand. If he lost, Britannia would be lost to the Saxons forever. The Britons took the high ground, fortifying the hilltop with wooden barricades and stone walls. Ambrosius's army was outnumbered, but he had learned from the old Roman ways. He would use discipline, strategy, and the land itself to his advantage. Across the valley, Hengist's warriors assembled. Thousands of Saxons, Angles, and Jutes stood ready, their spears glinting in the morning sun. They had burned and butchered their way across the land, but now they faced a force unlike any they had encountered before. A Briton army united under a single banner. The Battle of Badon Hill. The battle began at dawn. The Saxons charged up the hill, their war cries shaking the earth. But Ambrosius had prepared for this. The Britons held firm behind their wooden barricades, pelting the enemy with javelins and arrows. When the Saxons reached the walls, they found themselves trapped in a killing ground. Again and again, the Saxons surged forward, but the Britons did not break. Ambrosius himself led a counterattack, his warriors crashing into the enemy like a thunderbolt. The fighting was brutal. Shields splintered, swords shattered, and blood soaked the hillside. Then, in the chaos, Ambrosius came face to face with Hengist. The Saxon warlord was a towering figure, his blade red with the blood of Britons. They clashed, swords ringing like iron bells. Hengist was strong, but Ambrosius was faster. With a final strike, he drove his sword into Hengist's chest. The Saxon chieftain staggered, eyes wide with shock, then collapsed. Seeing their leader fall, the Saxons wavered. The Britons, sensing victory, roared as they drove their enemies back down the hill. By nightfall, the Saxons were in full retreat, fleeing eastward toward their remaining strongholds. The fate of Britannia, the victory at Badon Hill, was total. The Saxon advance was broken, and for the first time in years the Britons held the upper hand. Ambrosius pursued the enemy, reclaiming lost lands and driving the invaders back to their strongholds along the eastern coast. But he knew the war was not truly over. The Saxons had been defeated, but they were not gone. They would return in greater numbers, with new warlords and new ambitions. Britannia had won a reprieve, but not peace. As Ambrosius stood on the battlefield, looking over the bodies of the fallen, he understood the truth. Rome was gone, and it would never return. But a new Britannia could rise from the ashes, one forged not in the image of emperors, but in the spirit of those who had fought for their homeland. The war for Britain was not over, but for now, Britannia still stood.